I was sitting in a crowded cafe, staring blankly at my laptop screen, pretending to work. The truth was, I hadn't done anything productive in hours. My mind was a jumble of frustration and exhaustion, fueled by another sleepless night spent dreading the monotony of my job. At 29, I had a corporate gig that many would consider enviable, a steady paycheck, good benefits, and a clear path to promotions. But I hated it. Every morning felt like dragging myself through quicksand, knowing I'd spend the next 8 hours staring at spreadsheets, answering emails, and sitting through meetings that went nowhere. That particular Thursday afternoon, I had escaped to the cafe in a desperate attempt to break the cycle. The coffee shop was my little sanctuary, filled with the hum of conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the comforting smell of freshly brewed coffee. But even there, I couldn't shake the weight of my discontent. I must have looked miserable, because when a stranger asked if he could share my table, I barely managed a nod. The place was packed, and he didn't have much choice. "Thanks," he said as he set his coffee cup down. He was probably in his mid-40s, with a salt and pepper beard and a well-worn leather satchel. He gave off a laid-back, confident vibe, like someone who didn't rush through life. For the next few minutes, we sat in silence, me pretending to type and him sipping his coffee while jotting notes in a small notebook. I glanced at him occasionally, curious about his scribbles, until he caught me staring. "Sorry," I said, embarrassed. "No problem," he replied with a grin. "Tough day?" I hesitated before answering. "Tough year, actually." That was all it took for the conversation to start. He introduced himself as Greg, a freelance writer who had left a corporate job a decade ago. When he asked what I did, I gave him the usual rundown: marketing analyst, good company, steady paycheck. "And you hate it," he said matter-of-factly. I blinked at him, caught off guard. "How did you know?" He chuckled. "You're not exactly hiding it. I've been there." It turned out Greg's story wasn't all that different from mine, at least at first. He had climbed the corporate ladder, collected the accolades, and checked all the boxes of success. But one day, he realized he was miserable. "I remember sitting in a meeting about quarterly projections," he said, "and it hit me, I didn't care. Not about the numbers, not about the outcome, not about any of it. I was just going through the motions." His words struck a nerve. That was exactly how I felt, like I was sleepwalking through my life. "So, what did you do?" I asked, genuinely curious. "I quit," he said simply. "Not right away, of course. I planned, saved, and figured out what I wanted to do. But yeah, I walked away." "And you became a writer?" "Eventually," he said. "At first, I just wanted to figure out what made me happy. Writing was something I'd always loved but never thought I could do for a living. Turns out, I was wrong." We talked for over an hour. Greg didn't sugarcoat anything. Freelancing was hard, unpredictable, and often stressful. But he loved the freedom it gave him, the chance to work on projects he cared about, and the ability to structure his days around what mattered to him. "Look," he said as he packed up to leave, "I'm not saying you should quit your job tomorrow. But life's too short to spend it doing something that makes you miserable. Figure out what you want, and don't be afraid to go after it." Greg's words stayed with me long after he left. That night, for the first time in years, I sat down with a notebook and started writing, not spreadsheets or to-do lists, but my thoughts, my fears, and my dreams. It wasn't an overnight transformation. For months, I kept going to my job, doing just enough to get by while secretly plotting my escape. I started freelancing on the side, writing articles for small websites and blogs. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay was laughable at first, but I loved it. The more I wrote, the more I realized how unhappy I had been in my corporate life. Writing made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. When I finally quit my job a year later, I was terrified. But I was also excited, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my life. It's been 3 years since that cafe conversation. I'm not rich, and I don't have the stability I once did, but I've never been happier. I work with clients I care about, write stories that matter to me, and have the freedom to shape my days however I want. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if Greg hadn't sat at my table that day. Would I have eventually found my way out of my rut, or would I still be stuck, staring at spreadsheets and dreading Mondays? I'll never know. But what I do know is this: one conversation can change everything. If you're feeling stuck, unhappy, or lost, don't ignore it. Talk to someone, write it down, or just take a moment to ask yourself what you really want. You might be surprised at where it leads you. For me, it led to a cafe, a stranger, and a life I never thought possible. Second story. I didn't mean to call her. That's how it started, an honest mistake, one I've made 100 times before but never thought twice about. It was a Wednesday evening, and I was trying to order takeout from my favorite Thai place. I must have misdialed by one digit. "Hello," her woman's voice answered, a hint of irritation already present. "Hi, I'd like to place an order for pickup," I said, not realizing my mistake. There was a pause. "I think you have the wrong number," she said flatly. Embarrassed, I apologized and hung up, double-checking the number before calling the restaurant. I figured that would be the end of it, just another forgettable moment in the sea of daily interactions. But it wasn't. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from the number I had just accidentally called, *, no worries about the wrong number. Hope you get your food. *, I chuckled at the unexpected friendliness and replied, *, thanks. Sorry again for bothering you. *, I didn't think much of it until the next evening when she texted again, *, so, did the food end up being any good? What followed was an exchange that lasted longer than I expected. Her name was Claire, and she lived in a city 3 hours away. She worked as a nurse and had a dry sense of humor that made me laugh more than I had in weeks. I learned she'd had a rough day when I called, something about a long shift and a patient who'd yelled at her for reasons she didn't disclose. She said my wrong number had been a welcome distraction. It wasn't like me to keep texting someone I didn't know, but something about her felt easy, familiar. Over the next few weeks, we exchanged sporadic messages. What started as casual small talk grew into deeper conversations about work, life, and the things that weighed us down. One evening, Claire told me about her father. He had passed away a year earlier, and she was still grappling with the loss. She spoke about him with a mixture of fondness and sadness, describing how he'd taught her to ride a bike, how they used to watch old westerns together, and how his illness had been both sudden and drawn out. I found myself opening up in return, sharing things I hadn't told anyone in years. I told her about my strained relationship with my own father, how we hadn't spoken since a fight 6 years earlier. The details didn't matter much, but the silence between us had grown into something neither of us seemed willing to break. Claire didn't judge or offer unsolicited advice. She just listened, or rather, she read. It felt oddly cathartic to type out things I'd been bottling up. Months passed, and Claire became a fixture in my life. We never met in person, but her messages were a constant, like a thread weaving through the fabric of my daily routine. We'd talk about everything: movies, our favorite foods, the absurdity of life. But beneath the light-hearted banter, there was an undeniable depth to our connection. Then, one day, she went quiet. I didn't hear from her for over a week. At first, I assumed she was busy, but as the days stretched on, I started to worry. Finally, I sent a message, *, just checking in. Everything okay? Her reply came hours later, sorry for disappearing. Things have been rough. Can I call you? When the call came, her voice sounded small, distant. She told me she'd been struggling with her mental health, that the weight of her father's absence had become unbearable lately. She'd withdrawn from everyone, unsure how to face the world. I stayed on the phone with her for hours that night, just listening. It felt strange, hearing her voice for the first time after so many months of texting. She sounded exactly as I'd imagined, and yet completely different. Claire's honesty that night did something to me. It made me realize how much I'd been avoiding in my own life, especially my unresolved issues with my father. Over the next few weeks, I found myself thinking about him more and more. I didn't know how to fix things, but I knew I couldn't keep ignoring it. One Sunday morning, I picked up the phone and dialed his number. The conversation was awkward, stilted, and filled with long pauses. But it was a start. For the first time in years, we were talking. When I told Claire about it, she was ecstatic. "It's not about having the perfect conversation," she said. "It's about showing up." Our friendship continued for 2 years. We never met in person, life always seemed to get in the way, but we remained each other's sounding boards, cheerleaders, and occasional reality checks. Then, one morning, I woke up to a text from her sister. Claire had passed away in her sleep after a long battle with an undiagnosed heart condition. I was devastated. For days, I couldn't bring myself to read through our old messages. When I finally did, I found myself smiling through the tears. She had left a mark on my life that was impossible to ignore. Claire taught me that sometimes, the most meaningful connections come from the most unexpected places. A wrong number, a chance text, and a willingness to engage with a stranger had changed my life in ways I never could have predicted. If you're reading this, take it as a sign. Reach out to someone you've been avoiding, strike up a conversation with a stranger, or just let yourself be open to the possibility of connection. You never know where it might lead. Third story. It all started with a flat tire. I was driving home from a long day at work, the kind of day where the minutes felt like hours and the hours felt like an eternity. My head was pounding, my stomach was growling, and all I wanted was to collapse onto my couch and forget the world existed. But as I drove past the dimly lit side of a back road, I saw her. She was standing by an old sedan with its hood popped open, waving her arms like a castaway stranded on a deserted island. It was late November, cold enough to see your breath in the air, and she wasn't wearing a coat. I almost kept driving. In fact, I did for about 20 feet before I slammed on the brakes and cursed under my breath. Something about the desperation in her face tugged at me. Against my better judgment and a voice in my head screaming about stranger danger, I turned around. Her name was Marcy. She looked to be in her late 20s, with a pale, tired face and dark circles under her eyes that told a story of sleepless nights. Her car was a wreck, one of the tires completely shredded, and it was clear she didn't have a spare. "Thank you for stopping," she said, her voice shaky but warm. "You're the first person who even looked my way." I nodded, unsure how to respond. "Do you have someone you can call?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not really." Something about her answer made me pause. There was an edge to it, a vulnerability she was trying to hide. I knew I should have just called her a tow truck, but instead, I offered to drive her to the nearest gas station. She hesitated, but eventually agreed. The ride was awkward at first. Marcy stared out the window, occasionally giving me directions to the station. But as we sat in the silence, I couldn't help but notice the faint smell of cigarettes and something else, like cheap air freshener trying to mask something more unpleasant. "Rough day?" I asked, attempting to break the ice. She let out a bitter laugh. "You could say that." As we talked, bits of her story began to unravel. She'd recently lost her job, fallen behind on rent, and was essentially living out of her car. The shredded tire was just the latest in a series of unfortunate events. I didn't know what to say. Her situation felt so far removed from my own cushy, albeit monotonous, life. But there was something about the way she spoke, proud but resigned, that made me want to help. When we got to the gas station, I insisted on buying her a meal from the convenience store. At first, she refused, but her hunger eventually won out. As she ate, I told her about myself, a mid-level office worker with a boring routine and a life that felt painfully predictable. She laughed at my self-deprecation, and for a moment, the heaviness between us lifted. That could have been the end of it, but as I watched her walk back to her car, something stopped me. Before I could overthink it, I called out, "Do you have a plan for tonight?" She turned, eyebrows raised. "Not really." "Let me help you," I blurted. "I can get you a room for the night." It's not much, but at least you'll be warm." Her eyes widened, and for a second, I thought she'd refuse. But then she nodded, and I felt a strange sense of relief. What started as a one-time gesture turned into something much bigger. Over the next few weeks, I found myself checking in on Marcy, helping her with small things, getting her car fixed, finding job listings, and even lending her my old laptop. It wasn't charity, it felt more like a partnership. In return, she taught me things I didn't even realize I needed to learn. She had a way of seeing the world that was raw and unfiltered. She didn't sugarcoat her struggles, but she didn't wallow in them either. She was fiercely independent, even in the face of overwhelming odds. One night, over cheap pizza in my apartment, she said something that stuck with me. "People think I'm some tragic story, but I'm just me. Life is messy, and we all get lost sometimes. It doesn't mean we're broken." Over time, Marcy got back on her feet. She found a job at a local diner, saved up enough to rent a small studio, and even started taking community college classes. Watching her rebuild her life was nothing short of inspiring. But our friendship wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of tension, times when I overstepped, thinking I knew what was best for her, or when she pushed me away, needing space to figure things out on her own. Despite those moments, we remained close. She became more than just a stranger I'd helped, she became one of my closest friends. It's been 3 years since that night on the side of the road. Marcy is now finishing her degree in social work, determined to help others who faced hardships like hers. As for me, I've learned that life isn't about grand gestures or perfect plans. Sometimes, it's about the small, seemingly insignificant decisions, the ones that lead you to stop on the side of the road and change someone's life. Looking back, I can't imagine what my life would look like if I hadn't stopped for Marcy that night. She taught me the value of compassion, the power of resilience, and the beauty of taking a chance on someone, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. So, if you ever find yourself in a position to help someone, even if it's just offering them a warm meal or a kind word, don't hesitate. You might just end up changing both of your lives in the process.